Welcome to Long Story Short, a podcast where two financial advisors, one rooted in financial planning, the other in investment strategy, break down the questions we're actually hearing from our clients. Each episode, we tackle one or two real-world issues that matter to high-net-worth individuals, from market-moving news to personal finance decisions with lasting impact. No jargon, no fluff, just clear, thoughtful insights from the front lines of wealth management. We keep it short, but we don't cut corners. This is Long Story Short.
So Adam, do you know what the average retirement age is for an NFL player?
28.
You got it. The reason I thought about this is, yeah, you nailed it. 27.6 years. I'll round that up to 28. Close enough for me.
End the show now.
That's it. So this came to mind because we're both NFL fans. Do you want to admit what your fandom is?
I'm a proud fan of the Cleveland Browns.
Love it.
The most well-respected NFL franchise with, I don't think any Super Bowls, but
okay.
A lot of entertainment in how they run their team.
Well, I mean,
I wear it proud on my sleeve now.
I love that.
I've graduated from the I'm ashamed phase.
No paper bags.
And so have you, because of your team and how well you've done the last year, right?
Well, I mean, it used to be embarrassing to admit. I'm a Commanders fan. Who knows what we're going to be calling them next year, but for now they're the Commanders. But the reason this question came up is they just signed Von Miller at 36 years age. And I was shocked. 36 years in the NFL? Like, might as well be an octogenarian.
36? Yeah, well, it's all nutrition, exercise. Good for him. He's keeping the NFL annuity going.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I think that that concept of retirement, right? We're talking, even 36 is young, right? And here I'm talking about this guy's ancient, but that whole concept of retirement is really interesting because we say that you're retiring from this job in the NFL, but I feel like most people in the NFL, right? You're retiring and you're probably not just sitting around and doing nothing. So I think you've got some really interesting insight that you've prepared for this episode, where you're talking a little bit about what does history mean? What is the history of retirement?
Well, it's really, I think the concept of retirement is one of those things that is set it and forget it for how we plan our lives. Retirement in and of itself has been around since 13 BC. We've got Emperor Augustus in Rome to thank for the original, concept of retirement, where soldiers who had served for about 20 years or more were given some form of a pension that was funded by taxes.
There probably weren't many of them
when you go,
back then.
Yeah, well, when you go to Rome, you see all these things. You're like, wow, they came up with this before anyone else did, and they were so ahead of their time. Well, retirement is another one of those things that the Romans were on the cutting edge of.
Who knew?
And we kind of hit a lull at 13 BC all the way until the late 18th, early 19th century, where over in Germany they established the first publicly funded social retirement system, their equivalent of Social Security, and that rolled all the way forward up until 1935 when the Social Security Act was passed, and the Social Security system as we know it was put into place, and is still alive and half alive based on how it's funded, but is certainly still alive and well. And a lot of the concept of retirement has anchored around these public and private pension and social programs that have been put in place. So things like the retirement date. When I ask someone, when do you think you should retire? It's always anchored around when you claim Social Security. It's somewhere between usually 62 and 65, sometimes a little later, sometimes a little earlier. So we've really latched on to that idea that, hey, we retire in our 60s and then we ride off into the sunset and vacation and play golf. But what's really interesting is when the very first form of publicly funded retirement pensions were put in place over in Germany, the life expectancy from the time someone would get this benefit until they died, if they even did, was like 2 or 3 years. So it was really meant to be end of life assistance, essentially. And even when the Social Security Act was passed, if someone had made it to their 60s, even at that point, with how life expectancy was trending, they were only retired, 5 to 7 years. So the most interesting aspect of this to me is we've anchored to these dates and life expectancy has continued to rise. So today you've got life expectancy in the late 70s, early 80s, and based on demographic, your level of wealth, like if you're you know wealthy by global standards, which for most of our listeners you likely are, your life expectancy is even over above those averages because of the funds you have to help pay for health care, and your quality of life is so strong. Um, but we've anchored to those dates. We're living a lot longer. So retirement, I joke with clients, and whenever I say this, their eyebrows kind of raise. I say, if you retire in your 50s or 60s, you could be retired longer than you were working.
Wow.
Depending on how long you live, right? Like,
Yeah.
so it's this idea of, you know, like we're defining the history of retirement, but we always try to emphasize like trying to help people define what they want retirement to look like, because this is not something you're doing for 5 to 7 years. This is something you're likely doing for many decades. So I thought that was fascinating. I think the global aspect of this is interesting. I'm always interested in how people around the world retire. And the idea that the Romans came up with this makes it extra interesting
Yeah.
on top of that.
But roads and aqueducts and retirement systems, huh?
And retirement, they had it all figured out. I don't know what would have happened. But, honestly, at this point, and you're going to see this, trend compound on itself because there's conflicting studies on longevity, but in general, the idea of living to 100 is probably even 10 years ago, people would have laughed if I said, "Hey, I'm projecting you live to 100 years old in your plan." It was kind of a laughing point in the meeting, but now people are getting more and more serious about it because
Mm-hmm.
it could happen. So if you retire at 50 in your mid 50s, you're looking at a 45-year retirement, which
Wow.
is
That's a long time.
incredible.
I mean, that's a really long
Yeah.
time. And so it's sort of like, you know, it's interesting to think about retirement, right? Because, you got to find something to do to fill that time. But I'm also curious, like from an investment standpoint, because a lot of I would say the rule of thumb is you approach retirement, you retire, all of a sudden everything about your portfolio should change. And in some ways I get it, right? Because you're moving on from like having, a W-2 where you're potentially growing your investments. Now you're tapping into your investment. So the concept is like most people take risk down in retirement. But if you've got 40, 45 years that you have to cover, I guess a question I have is, can you afford to do that, right? You probably still do need to have your
Yeah.
portfolio invested for growth. So I'd be really interested to like hear how you think through that problem and like how much should your portfolio change when you retire?
Yeah, the rules of thumb around investing in retirement can be really dangerous now because I would say one of the most common questions I field from clients is if they're even thinking about retirement is, hey, what should I do to my portfolio? I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I'm on the cusp of this life event. And so in my mind, I have built up this idea that now it's time to get more conservative. And that's not to say that for the right client that's not what you should do, but it really is incredibly personal. And I think we can highlight a few factors that really help lead you to the water on what this decision should look like. And I would say and we can go back and forth on this, Andy, because I know you've got a lot of good insight on this as well. But for me, the very first piece of this that you need to tackle is the psychological piece. What's someone's willingness to stomach market swings now that you're living off the portfolio and don't have employment income, hitting your bank account every month? That is a massive financial and psychological transition. market ups and downs. Imagine retiring in a month later. Look what we just saw happen earlier this year. So people retired January 1, 2025. We came right out of the gate with a really nasty 20%
Yeah.
drawdown that happened very quickly. But like, you need to talk with your advisor and you need to understand in this new phase of life, how much am I willing to stomach? And that in and of itself shouldn't make the decision, but that should really help set the stage for ultimately what your portfolio could look like. What's the range of options? Because if you're going to be in a more aggressive allocation, we hit a bear market and you're so sick to your stomach that you're, trying to plan a, vacation and enjoy retirement, but you can't do anything. You're like paralyzed because of watching your portfolio go down. That's a huge factor that impacts you financially, which we'll talk about, but also psychologically. So that's the first big
Yeah,
one.
that
What's
problem.
on your
Yeah,
list?
like the jargon term that you have for that is called sequence of return risk, right? Where it's
Hmm.
like, what happens in the immediate aftermath, first 2 to 5 years, I suppose, after you retire, like the course of the market over that time frame can really matter. Because if the market tanks, like you mentioned right off the bat, and you're pulling money out, like that's money that's never coming back. But if you have time to let it recover, as it basically always has done in the past, and if you think that's going to happen again, then having some way to stomach it. That's a really interesting point. To me, it's almost like retirement happens, but it's not something that usually just comes from out of left field, right? It's something that you can help plan for well ahead of time. So a lot of people like wait till they retire before they start thinking about making these big changes. But for me, it's probably something that should
Yeah.
happen a little more gradually, right? So like if you're inside of 5 years or so and you're contemplating retirement, it probably makes sense to start having those conversations about your portfolio. Because I think the if anything, I think the risk that we're like the mistake we're most afraid of is someone being too conservative with their wealth and then having their portfolio run out, later on in life, after they're able to go back to work. So like that to me, like figuring out what that right mix of aggressiveness should be even in retirement. And as you're approaching that makes a lot of sense. One thing that I have for you that, I think from a psychological standpoint maybe works. I'd love your take on it. Is so if the risk is like that sequence of return where who knows what the market does in the immediate after in right after you retire. What do you think of having really low risk, almost like cash reserve stored up for a set period of time, so that you can stomach that and pull from that source if the market were to fall, and then have the rest of your portfolio kind of invested more aggressively. So it's almost like you got a bucket, right? You got your really short term bucket that's going to cover a year or two of expenses, and then your long term bucket that's going to stay invested. What do you think of that approach in retirement?
So I think psychologically it's great. Certainly we're advocates of it. I think the way it's implemented in practice can look and feel a little bit different depending on the client. But generally, what we're doing, and just maybe to take a step back in the process that leads you to what each bucket should look like, it's taking an inventory of what you've accumulated versus what you're going to be spending versus what else is coming in terms of income sources. So, what you've accumulated is what's in your 401ks, your IRAs, your liquid assets that you're going to be drawing on to fund your retirement lifestyle. Your spending is what you think you're going to need to spend every month after taxes. And this is totally, I got asked the question, well, how much should I plan to spend in retirement? Is it a percentage of what I currently spend when I'm working? Is it some magical number based on my age? And the answer is absolutely not. This is, I've got clients that spend anywhere from $8,000 a month to $70,000 a month, right? I mean, the range
Mm-hmm.
is massive, and there's no way to just nail that with a rule of thumb or some general advice. It really is unique, and that spending number will fluctuate through time. So you don't need to get it perfect, but you need to get a general idea of what you're going to spend. And you need to weigh that all against what other income sources you have coming in. Do you have pensions? When will you be claiming Social Security? Those income sources, do you have rental properties? Those income sources take a little pressure off the portfolio because it's supplementing, what you need to meet those monthly expenses. So when you add up all that math and you take a look at the big picture, you're going to end up with some amount every month that needs to come out of the portfolio. And a really easy gauge that I like to check is what percentage of the portfolio do you need to draw on every month to meet that, spending amount, that spending requirement. And this, just anecdotally and from what I see, that either is somewhere from 2% of the value of the portfolio to 6% of the value of the portfolio.
Yeah,
There's a
like
range.
4% is like the rule
And
of thumb, if I'm remembering
4%
correctly.
is like the
Yeah,
rule of thumb, and we can have all kinds of
right.
conversations about the 4% rule, right, and what it means and doesn't mean. But in general, people need to draw somewhere in that range. If they've been good savers, that's usually where they land. And I think that is really, when you combine that required spending amount with their stomach for market ups and downs, you get you start to get closer to the right portfolio mix.
Hmm.
And someone, just to give you an example, someone who has a really great stomach for market volatility and is only spending down 2% of the portfolio value every year, do they need to be really conservative? No, they can have a really meaningful amount of equity exposure, and position themselves really well for the long term because their spending level is low relative to their assets, and also they've got the appetite for the risk, and their money. If we do hit a rough patch in the market, they've got a significant percentage of the portfolio that has time to recover. And on the flip side, if someone has an iffy appetite for market ups and downs, and they're spending 5 to 6% of the value of the portfolio early on in retirement, that might translate to a not a overly conservative allocation, but maybe to a mix that has a little more, um, you know, diversifying or safer assets as part of the allocation. And I think when you go through that exercise, Andy, to your question about the bucketing, I think when you match all that up, it naturally lines up to 3 to 5 ish years of expenses in safer, more stable assets. So I think
Hmm.
you arrive at the same conclusion, but it's through unique circumstances and not just, hey, have 3 years of spending in cash.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because obviously too much cash, you introduce cash drag to the portfolio, and that can be destructive to overall returns too, right? So it's always a balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I want to hear from you on is, we share that chart on, I don't know, it goes back to like 1900 or
Yeah.
something crazy like that, and it shows stocks, bonds, cash, and gold.
Hmm.
And when we talk about the benefits of being, a little more aggressive through such a long retirement runway, why is that? Like, what does that data tell you?
Yeah. So I mean, so that chart, and I think the best way to think about returns are, you want to look at what the average return has been. You also want to look at the volatility of those returns, right? So when we look at, let's just say, take stocks versus bonds versus cash, right, over a really short window. Obviously stocks have the highest average return, bonds are in the middle, cash are the lowest, but also that relationship flips when we think about volatility. So cash, pretty much what you have is what you're going to get at the end of the year. Bonds have a little bit of volatility, but chances are you're going to make a little bit of money that year. Equities can be up 50, down 50, right? Huge variations in a very
Oh
short
yeah.
period of time. But the really interesting thing is, as you go further into the future, 3 year, 5 year, 10 years, 20 years, right? And 20 years might sound insane since we're talking about your retirement assets, but as you pointed out,
That's half a retirement.
life expectancy is getting you past that number, right? And the really
Yeah.
fascinating thing is, when you compare just the rolling 20-year time frame, the average return in stocks is obviously the highest, but also the measure of volatility, which we're going to use standard deviation here, is actually even tighter than it is for bonds. So bonds have actually been a little bit more volatile than stocks. If you run the numbers and look back over a rolling 20-year time frame, there's actually never been a 20-year time frame in the US where stocks have generated negative returns. So if you can stick with it in those really volatile short-term time windows, and you're investing long-term, it may be the prudent thing to do to hold equities in a significant proportion in retirement.
Right. So that proverbial, 60/40, stock to bond portfolio. That's the quintessential cookie cutter rule of thumb retirement investment mix. You know, kind of what we're landing on is that should look definitely more like a 70-30, right? Like in terms of the magnitude of the equity exposure to the bonds, layering on top of that the personal factors we've already discussed, but a more a more meaningful allocation to equities makes a ton of sense. And so that's a great way to think about. You wrote that blog article on our website. Why is this in my portfolio? And it goes
Yes.
through like this whole
Exclamation point,
thought.
question mark, exclamation point. Yes.
Yeah. Like why is this here? And that's like the best question you can ask as an investor. We should absolutely understand why we're invested in what we're invested in. That's the case for stocks. So, well, I might counter what you just said, Andy, and say, well, okay, well, if we know stocks are going to be, the best, performers over many, many decades, if they have lower volatility over the long run, then why, make the case for me and explain why something like bonds is so crucial to the portfolio.
Well, if you asked our, Jack Burney, his answer would be, don't ruin a perfectly good portfolio with bonds. But I
Right.
think the truth is, you can look at the data, right? And if you're an economic man and you're trying to maximize your returns, maybe that is the right move for you. But I think for the majority of people out there, that short-term time frame is really crucial, just from a psychological and emotional standpoint, right? So not everyone can stomach watching their retirement assets fluctuate as wildly as they will in the short term with stocks. So still diversifying assets like bonds. I'd even throw alternatives in that mix. Have a place just to help smooth that returns over the short term. But similar to what I was talking about earlier about cash drag, you want to make sure you find the right balance for that, right? So you want to find those diversifying asset classes that help smooth out the ride for stocks. But if you overdo it, at the end of the day, you're sacrificing too much in long-term return, and maybe you're not getting enough of that short-term benefit. So I think what I like to do is just think about, and I think we did a webinar and I made this point. So if I'm repeating myself for some of you, that's okay. But what I like to do is, when we're like in a normal time like we are now, where stocks are doing well, the market, everyone is going to have your concerns, but like there's no panic right now, right? So we're in what psychologists
Right.
would call a cold state, right? So you think about how like you feel about your portfolio now, you're probably not that stressed out about it. You probably feel pretty good about it. In fact, I think I've had clients who are like saying we should up the risk on it. But I caution you
Yeah.
before you do
Yeah.
that.
Give me more of that.
Yeah, exactly. I caution you before you do that is it's really important. Like one of the like psychological superpowers we have is we can time travel. We can put ourselves in the perspective in the future and in the past. So what I say is like go back to how you felt in early April and think, okay, what how emotional was I, right? Because what happens is when the stock market falls, right, our brains kind of go into overdrive, right? Our amygdala starts firing like crazy. We have this fear response, we have this stress response, and all of a sudden we're not
Fight or flight.
right, exactly, and we're not thinking as rationally as we otherwise might be. In fact, psychologists have tested people in a normal cold state versus what we will call here this like stressed out hot state, right? And they actually score worse on things like IQ tests when they're in the so-called hot state. So just think about how you felt back then and try to remember what you were thinking, because I think that's going to be so important for you to predict, how you're going to react to future drawdowns, right? If you were fine and you weren't that panicked, then maybe increasing the aggressiveness is the right move. But if you were really panicked and you're considering now like increasing the risk allocation just because stocks have recovered so much, really think about it, right? Because the reason we have these other diversifying asset classes is to smooth out that ride and ultimately to keep you invested when things get tough.
Yeah, and I think right on. And I think the data behind that, if you look at the historical data on these drawdowns and what it means for stocks versus bonds in the short run, go back to the early 2000s, the dot-com bubble bursting, and then shortly after the financial crisis, we had 50+% drawdowns in equities, and intermediate term government bonds were up,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes double digits. So you get, I mean, think about that delta in a large portfolio of something falling 50% versus something else going up, even slightly. that's the kind of balance you need to put yourself in the shoes of someone, using a very simple example, someone with a, $2 million portfolio, some portion of it, say 2/3, falls half, but the remaining is still holding steady, and that's where you're drawing your monthly retirement income from. That's a whole different experience than someone with all their money in stocks and seeing the whole thing fall down from 2 to 1 million while also drawing a higher spending level from the account. So that's the reason. It's really to mitigate, like you said, Andy, that sequence of return risk. Is the idea of like, I'm not going to be able to nail the market environment when I retire. So I just need to have this amount of portfolio insurance to make sure I can get through to the other side of my early distribution years, let the market recover if things don't go well, and then let that compounding um, do its thing.
Yeah, well, it's
So
an interesting point you make there about, your portfolio value going from 2 million to 1 million, right? Because I think typically when we set that spending rate, that's like what I need, right? Like I need to pay for groceries, car payments,
yeah, your
gas,
spending doesn't go
right?
in
Like
half.
your spending is going to stay where it is, right? And so if your portfolio all of a sudden drops, your really nice sustainable 4% rate all of a sudden is a really unsustainable 8% rate, right? That you weren't planning for. So like the dollars and cents of this matter a lot. We like to talk about things in terms of percentages all the time, but like that's always a moving target.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One spending amount from a $2 million portfolio looks and feels a heck of a lot different when it goes down to 1 million. So, and again, spending flexibility is another huge piece of this. And we talked earlier about budget, and what's fascinating to me is the process of watching people come up with a budget. It is so unique, and certain expenses change. I always tell people, don't put so much pressure on yourself to nail your retirement budget. You can make all the spreadsheets in the world, but not until you're living it do you really know what that's going to look like. So give yourself a little bit of wiggle room there. But I have, this is the psychological element as well. I have some clients that say, I need my $15,000 a month. If I don't get that, then I'm not living the retirement that I want to live, and I might as well go back to work. I'm going to be stressed out. I need this amount for spending, no ifs, ands, or buts. And then I've got other clients that say, yeah, you know what, it's fine. I'll draw my 15,000. If the market takes a hit, I'll cut it down to 10 until it recovers. Like, that's a whole different conversation from a planning standpoint, and there's not a right or wrong answer to that. We all dial up and down our own level of flexibility throughout life in many different areas, but that's something for people to think about
Mm-hmm.
in terms of retirement. It's like, how flexible am I willing to be with my spending as we go through early retirement market cycles?
Yeah. So if I'm going to sum this up, it sounds like you want people to think long and hard about what their annual budget is, how much money they need to replace that paycheck, right? So think long and hard about that, figure out what is that as a percentage of your overall investable assets, right? And do you have income sources elsewhere that might keep that number down? And then based on that, now you can think about, what should the asset allocation be? But be careful not to over-index on the conservative side, because you probably have a pretty long life expectancy, right? And so having a meaningful risk appetite and risk allocation is going to be something that you need to strongly consider. Have I summed that up about right? Have I forgotten anything there?
A plus on the report card. The
Who
only
needs
thing that I'll
AI?
add on top of that that I did not mention yet was that this needs to change through time. This is an exercise. This is you know, a thought experiment that should be continuing and continuing throughout retirement, because you will change. Remember, we're talking about multiple decades of being retired. You know, you are not the same retiree in your 80s as you were in your 60s.
I love the way you
Uh,
phrase this, right? You've got like a really clever phrasing for this as you get older.
the go-go
That's
years, the
right.
slow-go years, and the no-go years, right? That's a that's a those that like to try and fragment out the retirement life cycle. The go-go years early on is when you do most of your travel, your spending, you're more nimble and you're able to get out and about more. This is when people try to enjoy themselves at 100 miles an hour. And then the slow go years usually come around, and this age is changing. I've got clients in their 80s that are active now. I got to be careful, but normally by your early 80s, late 70s and your 80s, you're starting to be slightly limited in how much running around you can do. And then obviously when you hit your late 80s, 90s, you're less immobile. But I don't know. I've got an 88-year-old, 86-year-old client that is taking a trip to Australia and New Zealand. So
Amazing.
I have to be careful because
Yeah.
that's the kind of trip people are staying. They're living longer and they're staying active longer.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that's so important, right? I think they say like
Yeah.
lifting weights as you get older is really, really important to increase that longevity.
Yeah, I love all the nutrition and despite the fact I don't follow it, all this research coming out on longevity and exercise, people are more well informed on what they're putting in their bodies with the medical advancements. It's like one big math equation that says uh, save money while you're working so that you can prepare to live for 40 to 50 years and root for some other team other than the Redskins or the Commanders and the
Yeah.
Browns.
Yeah, do not recommend it. They have technically won a Super Bowl. The Commanders, I guess they were the Redskins at the time, have won a Super Bowl in my lifetime. So I can say that. I may have been one, but they did win it. So we've got that going for us.
Yeah, there you go. Put it on the board.
So
One more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to put this one to you because
Yeah.
we've talked about rules of thumb, conventional wisdom around retirement portfolios. We've alluded to some of the blog posts that are out there that you've written and our firm has put out on these topics. But, we talk about the building blocks of the retirement portfolio. We're referencing a lot about stocks and bonds.
Mm-hmm.
You said one word in there, alternatives, that is potentially another piece of the puzzle. This is unique for everybody, another very personalized factor into the retirement planning equation. But what would be your couple minute at most elevator pitch on alternative investments and what they do in a retirement portfolio?
Right. Yeah. So alternatives is really broad as a category. It basically means anything that's not stocks, bonds, or cash. Right? That you
The
can
Wild
invest
West.
in, right? It can be a lot of things. So let me first start by saying what it's not. I'm not talking about cryptocurrency. Maybe that's the right fit for you. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about gold or commodities or crazy option
Stamps.
strategies or artwork, even though I think at a certain wealth level, sometimes art can make sense. There's a Billions episode actually about that, but I won't get into it. What I'm really talking about here are asset classes that do exhibit positive returns. They might have some level of volatility that's between stocks and bonds, but really the biggest benefit is low to no correlation with traditional asset classes, right? So that's the big
So
benefit.
what is correlation?
So correlation, summed up, is essentially if one thing moves, the other thing moves with it, right? And so let's just say that, that sounds great, right? If stocks go up and I'm investing in something else that goes up when stocks go up, that's awesome. I'm making a lot of money all at the same time. But the other side of that coin is what happens when stocks go down, right? So if there's a high correlation between asset classes, stocks go down, the other thing I have in my portfolio goes down, that's not really adding any diversification benefit.
That's not
to your portfolio.
diversification.
What
Yeah.
you want is when your risk assets are going down, you want something else that might not be, right? So that could be a negative correlated asset class, but you probably don't want negative correlation because negative correlation means that, that thing is going down when your stocks are going up and stocks go up 4 to 5 years, right? So that's a bad bet. So really what you're looking for is something that can still go up even when your stocks go down, but can also potentially go up when your stocks, go up, right? You want there to be no relationship between the two. So that means let's just say, that your stocks are going up. This thing might not be going up as much as your stocks are, but when the stocks fall, the hope is that this thing is also not falling, right? And you can use this as like a buoy in your portfolio or even a source to rebalance from in your portfolio into the depressed prices below. So that's all wonky. A great hard concrete example of this is what happened in 2022. So in 2022, bear market in stocks, but the Fed was aggressively raising rates because inflation was the problem. So it was also a bear market in bonds. So your stocks and your bonds were correlated in a time when everything was going down. That's bad. But managed futures is an example of an alternative investment that relies on trend following across a wide range of different types of asset classes, and really it doesn't need the stock market to be going up or down. It just needs there to be a trend. And so because it was a pretty orderly market, just happened to be orderly to the downside, managed future strategies did outstanding in that year. Most of them were up like double digits over the course of that time frame. So here you have a year where if you're in your 60-40 stock bond portfolio, your stocks are down 18%, your bonds are down 12% or whatever it was. But now you've also got this other asset class, right? If you diversify it into alternatives, that is up at the same time. So that is hugely beneficial because it means that your portfolio level risk is significantly lower. So when we think about alternatives, yes, we want something that'll make you money, but that low to no correlation is the crucial piece and something to strongly consider in retirement.
Something else in the portfolio that marches to the beat of its own drum.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to react to different. You think about the world economy. If I were to say to someone, hey, explain the global markets and use a broad term like that, you'd say there's commodities, there's currencies, there's real assets, there's stocks, there's bonds, right? And they all will move up and down for various factors at different points in time. So the generic rule of thumb and the conventional wisdom was like, hey, you only need two things in your portfolio, stocks and bonds. We've seen their correlations in terms of how they move together go up, right?
Mm-hmm.
More recently,
happened in 08,
they tend to go up and down
2022.
together.
Yeah.
So introducing a third category that might behave differently to different factors, not that it's connected in any way to stocks or bonds, but that it introduces one more lever in the portfolio that can help you achieve whatever target rate of return you have and keep some level of balance. Like Andy said, this is, the way I define it, is alternative to the Wild West, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of junk out there. You're dealing with high fees, low liquidity, opaqueness, right?
Mm-hmm,
There's not
definitely.
always a lot of transparency. So like there are thousands and thousands of options. Not all of them. I would argue most of them are probably junk and not giving you what you need in terms of portfolio construction. But if our team invests a ton of time into this, we have our own set of criteria, and we think if done well with the right risk controls in place, can help with balance in retirement portfolio.
Yeah, not to get too wonky here, but what you're looking to maximize is something called risk-adjusted returns. So return over risk, right? And that can be improved when you consider adding low to no correlation assets. So that's what you're looking for in the alternative space.
Yeah. So that is like the full our 30-minute version of the full rundown of preparing for and investing in retirement, with a little retirement history lesson thrown in there.
Thanks, Professor
for
Adam.
educational purposes. There's a lot more rabbit holes to go down with these retirement history notes here. But if you've got any questions that you would like us to address in a future weekly episode, a long story short, we've created an email address, which is longstoryshort@burney.com. So you can fire off an email. Our team will put it up for review, and we'll continue down this path of relevant market and retirement topics.
This podcast featured Adam Newman and Andy Pratt of Burney Wealth Management, which is a division of the Burney Company, an investment advisory firm. Adam is managing partner and is chartered financial analyst, certified financial planner, master of taxation, and retirement income certified professional. And Andy is senior partner and director of investment strategy and is a chartered financial analyst and chartered alternative investment analyst. Long Story Short involves general discussions of a broad range of current financial topics related to financial planning, taxes, investment, and retirement. This content is for informational, educational purposes only and is not intended as personalized investment advice or recommendation. It does not take into account your financial situation. You'll need to consult with a qualified financial advisor or professional who is familiar with your specific circumstances. Investing involves risks, and past performance is not indicative of future results. The Bernie Company is an SEC registered investment advisor. Registration with the SEC or any state securities authority does not apply to the Bernie Company or any of its principals or employees, possesses a particular level of skill or training in the investment advisory business or any other business. Bernie Company does not provide legal, tax, or accounting advice, but offers it through third parties. Before making any financial decisions, clients should consult their legal and/or tax advisors.